On day 2 of free agent frenzy, the Winnipeg Jets and Kevin Cheveldayoff have gone ahead and signed 5 players to some interesting deals, all of them two-way deals. We're going to talk about who those players are, where they fit in with the Jets lineup, and more likely the Moose lineup. And of course, we'll talk about the real reason why Kevin Cheveldayoff went out to go acquire these players. But before we do jump into the video, I couldn't help but notice on our last one, it looks like about 74% of you guys who watched that last video were not subscribed to our channel. I'd highly suggest you guys throw us a subscription here at Jets Digest. There's lots more news to come out this offseason. We have tons of RFAs who still need to sign. We're still holding our breath, waiting to see where Nikolai Ehlers is going to go. Of course, I'm sitting here hoping that he does re-sign with the Jets, but it's looking unlikely. Anyways, that's not the topic for today's video. Let's hop into it. Let's start off with our quote from the lovely, the wonderful Murat Atesh, a must-follow on Twitter if you're a Jets fan, and of course, I highly suggest checking him out at The Athletic. So, the quote coming out from him: Winnipeg announced the signing of 5 players to 1-year, 2-way contracts today. Goaltender Isaac Poultier from Winnipeg, defenseman Kale Clague, forward Phil Giuseppe, forward Walker Duehr, forward Samuel Fagemo. Sorry. There's some, and then he goes on to add in his own little perspective. There's some solid AHL quality here with some NHL games played. Duehr played 24 NHL games in the 24 games in the NHL last season. So, fantastic little quote there from Murat Atesh. But let's talk about the real reason why the Winnipeg Jets decided to sign these players. So, you notice Murat mentioning the AHL. You may notice in the background of my video, I've got my Moose jerseys out. The real reason why these players were signed: these guys are all going to be depth players. These guys are going to be all players who go down and most likely will start the season with the Moose, unless they surprise and, come out to camp with a crazy camp and, kind of force Scott Arniel and the coaching staff's hand and make them have to stay with the big club. But the reason why we talk about, the Moose needing some extra players, let's take a look at these standings from this past season. I can't help but notice this is the Western Conference. You go all the way from the top, all the way to the bottom, and you see the Manitoba Moose sitting at last place in the Western Conference last year. They were second last in the entire AHL last year. This is a team that needs to get better, and signing these players definitely will help out. And honestly, the real reason I look at this is as some good signings. I know it's not the the high ticket, it's not the Brock Besser, the Nick Ehlers signings that everyone is hoping for, but the Winnipeg Jets currently have a window, a Stanley Cup window that they are currently in right now. You've got Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuyck leading the pack on that. Obviously, Kyle Connor's coming up to the end of his deal, and we'll need to extend him or trade him for some assets in order to get an extension on this window. But the biggest thing that you can do to extend a window is have young players who can come into the league and provide value much higher than their entry-level contracts. So, the Jets have a pretty decent prospect pool. I would imagine that I'm gonna list off a couple guys here. I would imagine that some of these guys make the jump to the big club next year. So just starting off here, you've got Braden Yager. I don't think that he might get his entry level 9 games before his contract slides type of thing. He could come in and surprise. I'm really high on this guy, so I would really, really love to see him come and have a crazy camp and kind of force the Jets' hands and make him have to play with the team. But he's 20 years old now, so he's allowed to play in the AHL. I would expect him to be playing there most likely. You've got Colby Barlow, the first-round pick from a couple of years ago. You've got Fabian Wagner, Jacob Julian, Brad Lambert. I can't believe I didn't mention him. He's probably going to be vying for a spot on the Jets this year, but he had a pretty poor year last year. He only scored, I believe it was 6 goals. And so he might need another year in the oven, but at the same time, the Jets have opportunities, and holes in their lineups where a guy like that, if he has a strong summer, could definitely come in and break the mold, allowing himself to get onto the big club's lineup. You have Nikita Chibrikov, who I would imagine will be, playing probably in that kind of Mason Appleton spot, fighting with Cole Koepka, their most recent signing. If you want to know what I think about that one, go check that video out. But regardless, this is a move in order to make the Manitoba Moose a much more viable team. In the AHL, you this is usually a spot where you have your guys, your prospects, and it's a place for them to be able to get, top line minutes and, work on a team that is, where it's their team, and allow them to, continue to develop. So what I think this is just a move for the Moose to get better and hopefully be a more competitive team. It's always good to try and add some championship level, players. I'm talking championships for the Calder Cup. And, let's talk about the 5 players here. You've got Kale, Clague, who's a former second round pick. Let's bring up some of these graphics here. Let's take a look here. Alrighty, let's start with Samuel Fagemo. Okay, so this guy, he is, if you take a look at this little chart here, showing his stats throughout the years, you can see he's kind of alternated from playing some games with the big clubs in the NHL, but mostly he has done most of his work in the AHL. It looks like he's a pretty decent AHL scorer. In this past year, he had 67 games played, scored 29 goals, 17 assists for 46 points. Again, this is just adding some depth to the Manitoba Moose lineup. You want to have guys who can play with your Braden Yagers, your Colby Barlows, your Brad Lamberts, and provide some value to them. It's not going to be helpful for those guys to just go out there and not have anyone to play with. So this guy seems like a surefire player to come in and play for the Moose. I would be very, very surprised if any of the guys that we talk about today end up playing any games for the Jets, but that is totally fine. You need players like this to be able to push the needle. Let's move on. Let's talk about Phil Giuseppe. This one is a little bit cut off. He has a much bigger hockey reference than the rest of these guys. He's 31 years old, but if you take a look here, his most recent season in the AHL, he played with the Abbotsford Canucks, who went on to win the Calder Cup in the AHL. So again, adding a player who was contributing in the playoffs. You see he played 24 games in the playoffs. He had 14 points, 6 goals, 5 assists. My apologies. He had 11 points, 6 goals, 5 assists in the playoffs. Again, this is a guy just to try and add some leadership to that club. Obviously, the Winnipeg Jets have lost Dominic Toninato, who was the captain for the Manitoba Moose. And a guy who, constantly got pulled up to the Jets squad. But it'll be interesting to see how this pans out for the team. Let's move on to Isaac Poultier. He is a goaltender. And, at this point, again, I'm not going to yank your chain. This guy might not even play in the AHL next season. But you can see he's provided some decent numbers at the ECHL level. And, injuries always happen. Right now, this guy is 6th on the goaltender depth chart. You have, of course, Connor Hellebuyck, Eric Comrie, Chris Driedger. Then you get down to the AHL, and you've got Thomas Milic, Dominic DiVincentes, and Isaac Poultier. So I wouldn't be surprised if this guy doesn't end up playing all that much for the AHL, but he has provided some decent numbers. I can see back with the Utica Comets in 23-24, he did have a .911 save percentage, so not too bad, nothing to scoff at. And also, usually at these lower leagues, it's tougher for goaltenders to stand out unless they are absolute studs. But let's move on to our next one. Let's hop over and talk about Walker Duehr. This is a guy who actually could potentially play for the Jets next year. I highly doubt it. This is a guy who, when I watched him playing with Calgary, he was really frustrating to play against. He's a bigger guy. He's 6'2", decently heavy, and he's still pretty young, so he still has some potential to, maybe have a good camp, turn some heads on the coaching staff. But at this point, I would doubt he would be anything more than an AHL player. These stats that we have on screen, he played 24 games in the NHL last year, had 2 goals, 1 assist. Again, nothing that interesting, but at the AHL level, he did provide a lot of value to the San Jose Barracudas. But anyways, just to talk about all that, it's going to be still interesting. I know we're a little bit disappointed. Some people are a little bit disappointed with how free agency has gone, but honestly, I said this before, the free agency seems to be a time when GMs put themselves into bad positions, getting players to sign for, longer and more expensive than they should. This year's free agency class was not that great, other than, Nikolai Ehlers and I guess Mitch Marner, who didn't even make it to free agency. This has been a pretty weak free agency class. So, again, while these aren't the shiniest, most important moves, these moves are super duper important in order to keep your AHL team moving. You don't want your AHL team to be, bottom of the league and having players on it who are getting frustrated and aren't really getting the support that they need in order to flourish. So I would hope and I would expect if Brad Lambert, a guy who had a really disappointing year with the Moose last year, I would expect him to have a much better year this year. Hopefully he takes a step. Maybe he has a big summer and forces his way onto the big club, but at this moment here, that's up to him. It's also up to Braden Yeager, Colby Barlow, lots of guys who need to put in some work. And, if they do that, who knows? Maybe they end up on the big club. If they don't, they've at least got a decent supporting cast around them, and the Manitoba Moose should be much better off. But that'll be it for this one today. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Enjoy your summer. I'll be here around on Jets Digest talking about every move that the Winnipeg Jets make. So make sure you hit the like button, hit subscribe. Have a great day.